Good afternoon. I'm Jim Hoagland, contributing editor of the Washington Post. It's my job to welcome you and to congratulate you on being such serious people on a sunny, last gas summer day to come and spend time with us is a real remarkable accomplishment for you. Now we'll move on to the subject of the day, The Weary Policeman by Allin and Erik Jones. They are two transatlanticists whom I have learned with some surprise from this volume. At this point I should hold up the book so you can all see it, go out and buy it, and most of all, read it. I've learned with some surprise that they have a high regard for Gaullism. Its founder and his acolytes, George Kennan and Jacques Chirac. You can find that on pages 45 and 46. They highlight the warnings of all three, of de Gaulle, of Kennan, and Jacques Chirac, that America had too much power for its own good and would inevitably be chastened, if not punished for it. A prime example they cite comes in the managed retrenchment undertaken by the Nixon administration after the folly of Vietnam. This retrenchment gradually was undone by a new outbreak of imperial hubris under the Reagan and Bush administrations, which, with the aid of another unnecessary war in their view in Iraq, has brought the U.S. to another period of having to pull in its spear-like horns. Pluralism, their much politer way of describing multipolarity, is the order of the day, they argue, something the U.S. should not fear or regret, but should learn to manage. Now, in fact, my summary, my impressionistic remarks, resemble what has been said about Wagner's music. That is, actually things are better than they sound. The U.S. decline is relative, say our authors, and not irreversible. The U.S. does have options it can exercise to manage the inevitable but relative decline in its economic power and its ability to persuade or coerce other rising nations, to follow its lead in global affairs. But it will require a lot of maturity and internal political cohesiveness on the part of Americans to manage this. As I read and perhaps oversimplify your argument, Dana and Erik, there's every chance that this decline is a cyclical one that will follow the expansion and contraction dialectic that we've seen before, if the U.S. will understand several important things, beginning with the fact that America does not benefit and will not benefit from spending to maintain overwhelming military superiority in this new globalized world, to maintain a permanent war footing, as you put it. The U.S. in fact needs to cut military expenditure to strengthen its domestic economy. That's the argument presented on page 167 and throughout the rest of the book. A second thing that the United States has to understand is, if I read you right, Iran can be treated as a nuclear-armed power that can be deterred even if it gets the bomb. And thirdly, that China is not an enemy but a banker, or at least a nation that does not deserve, currently, enemy stature. And then as I read the interesting parts on how European nations are responding to the Euro economic turmoil, not very well, at least until yesterday, being the shorthand description, and the implications of that for the U.S. policy, I began to think that perhaps your title should have been Weary Policemen, or Police Persons, to be more politically correct today. As you suggest, Europe is much more likely to be shedding defense responsibilities than filling in any gaps left by America as a continent-wide recession looms there. I like your argument that global imbalances have to be corrected, but I wonder if you will convince Mrs. Merkel with your subsequent thought that the first, quote, the first step is to recognize that government indebtedness is the symptom of the economic turmoil and not the cause. I think she would have some cases in point on Greece, Spain, and Italy to offer to you in rebuttal. To be slightly less glib, This book is an ambitious, serious attempt to look at the economic underpinnings of global political and military power, rather than to treat those subjects as separate items. You two deserve full credit for that. If you were to consider a second edition, and I hope you will, I would love to see you introduce some discussion of the economics of the shrinking role of nuclear deterrence and the rising role of missile defense in the spending dilemmas you described so well. Perhaps a few pages as well on the role of the established and social media in producing the political outcomes of American political dysfunction and European economic disorganization that you described. Finally, in that second edition, you will be able to lay out in greater detail how the Obama or Romney administration should go about developing the ability to conduct, quote, offshore balancing of power, unquote, that I take it you see as the path to safeguarding U.S. power and influence abroad. I think we could certainly welcome some discussion of that here today. And there are a number of interesting recommendations that we can perhaps debate in the question and answer session. I'm going to turn now over to Donna to start the discussion today, and then we'll come back for Q&A. But again, I want to thank you all for coming and for being the alert audience I'm sure you will be.
Jim, thank you very much. Now, that was a masterful presentation of our book, raising the question of whether I should really present anything at all. I mean, it is the case that some of the, how shall I put it, dialectical debates that we introduced into the book, you interpreted as us taking a very clear side when we probably should have, but we're a little bit wishy-washier. But maybe I'll explain that. But before I start, in addition to thanking you and for chairing this meeting, and obviously thanking everybody for your interest in coming to hear us speak, I want to start with one really profound note of thanks to Carol Dean, to the late Disc Dean, and the Robert and Artist James Foundation. Bob James and Carol Dean, I just saw, are with us today. And I just want to emphasize that their support was not just financial, but they really did push the Institute into posing the question of, in broadest terms, of whether the United States can and should remain the world's policeman. And as Jim said, it's a rather ambitious project, and I don't know if I would have, to be perfectly honest, I don't know if I myself would have picked so ambitious a project in what is, after all, rather large print, a reasonably small book. But I'm really, really grateful to have been nudged into doing so, because I think it's allowed me and Erik to think hard about America's global role in an historical perspective. Let me say something about what we mean by the age of austerity, and why, for that matter, the American policeman appears to be weary. We do not mean that the United States is insolvent under any common sense definition of the term. And this brings us right into current political debates, which are obviously very heated, but it is, I think, the case that returning to Clinton-era tax rates would cut something like close to $4 trillion off the national debt by 2020, which would bring our deficit down to about 2.5% of GDP, which means that under reasonable economic conditions, the debt would no longer be growing faster than the economy. Now, that's the medium term, of course. There's a long-term problem that is a serious problem in the Herb Stein sense, that if something can't go on forever, it's going to stop. And what is really worrying, of course, in the United States is the increase in healthcare costs. Let me just say, as a slight digression, I never quite understood how the problem of rising healthcare costs in the United States, particularly for the elderly, is seen as primarily or exclusively a federal budget problem. It's obviously a problem for our economy and our society. If healthcare costs are soaring, that damages the economy and the society, whether or not the bills are paid privately or through government. But it is the case that in our system, the government has a large role in healthcare, and it consequently has a big impact on the budget. and the long-term debt. Now, just to, I mean, we can debate this, and I'm going to say something that seems obvious to me, and it may not seem obvious to everybody here, so we should debate it. The solution is obviously going to have to entail, first of all, a way of restraining healthcare costs. Second, maybe slightly more controversially, restraint in defense spending. And third, higher taxes. Of these three parts of a package solution, only the first is technically difficult, and it is very difficult. The second is, to be sure, a strategic and political problem, but we did restrain defense spending in the last decade of the 20th century and contributed to a federal budget surplus that made Alan Greenspan worry about the end of the federal debt. That threat was dealt with rather well. And the third is, of course, the tax issue is an excruciating political problem, which I think is the main fault line in American politics right now. But meanwhile, the United States government can borrow vast sums of money at extremely low rates of interest. And not to belabor the point, I personally think it should be doing so vigorously to counteract the contraction in spending by state and local governments and the continuing deleveraging of the private sector economy. This Keynesian argument is also at the heart of the current, disputes about this Keynesian argument is also at the heart of the current political campaign. For the purposes of our discussion here, I just would observe one thing, which is that defense spending is also federal spending. It might have a lower multiplier effect, but it's not nothing. As Jonathan Chait rather mordantly observed, America got out of the Great Depression through the great Keynesian program of World War II, and if they had taken all those tanks and airplanes and dumped them into the ocean rather than deploying them to the battlefield, it would have had exactly the same economic benefit without obviously the horrific human consequences. So I just wanted to put this, put baldly my view about contemporary issues, and I think Erik agrees with them, because the settling these contemporary issues are obviously crucial to also thinking about America's long-term strategic future. But if we step away from the current political debate, even if we have to come back to it, let me add another point of historical framing, and this point is going to convey a slightly different tone than what Jim emphasized from our book, although what he said was in our book is indeed in our book. But I would at the same time argue that Robert Kagan, whom I esteem as perhaps the most brilliant of the neoconservatives, was right to argue in I guess it was a New Republic article last winter, which was adapted from his latest book, that the middle of a savage, or in this case now a prolonged economic crisis, is precisely the wrong time to draw definite conclusions about the future of American global power. This, by the way, was the article that President Obama was referring to in a White House meeting a few hours before the last State of the Union address, where that is Obama, declared, quote, "Anyone who tells you that America is in decline or that our influence has waned doesn't know what they're talking about." I think it's worth perhaps reading a few lines from the Kagan article, which we also quote in our book. Kagan writes the following: "One recession, or even one severe economic crisis, need not mean the beginning of the end of a great global power. The United States suffered deep and prolonged economic crises in the 1890s, the 1930s, and the 1970s. In each case, it rebounded in the following decade and actually ended up in a stronger position relative to the other powers before the crisis. The 1910s, the 1940s, and the 1980s were all high points of American global power and influence." There's another way of looking at this, which is conveyed in the only slide of my presentation, if it comes up correctly. I looked at this earlier and I realized you can't really read the headings in the back, but this is from the IISS, the latest edition of the IISS Military Balance, which we've also reproduced in our book. It shows something that is, of course, familiar to all of you, but I think it's worth presenting nonetheless. Comparative defense expenditures in a form that looks like one of those astronomy books that I loved as a kid. Every planet inside Jupiter. And of course, Jupiter is the United States. And then alongside the United States, we see the defense spending share, or actually dollar totals of the next 9 biggest defense spenders. But the key point to make about this chart is that if you look at the next 9 powers, and since some of you can't read it, that's China, the United Kingdom, France, Japan, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Germany, India, Brazil. If you look at those next 9 powers, 4 of them are treaty allies of the United States, and a 5th is an American strategic partner. And of the remaining 4, only 2 can be considered, even remotely be considered hostile to American or Western values and interests. So that's the situation we face today. There are long-run problems that are not really addressed by this chart or by Kagan's historical argument. The first problem is one of, and I think Jim referred to this, the problem of relative decline. And here it's worth, I mean, there's a little bit of rhetorical sleight of hand in the argument Kagan makes. 2 of Kagan's historical examples are taken from periods when America's relative share of world output was growing. While his 3rd example was the decade during which our superpower rival was in the process of imploding. If you look at the challenge we might face from China, which is the most salient, or at least the most talked about example, I mean, the fact is China is likely to face all sorts of economic, political, and demographic problems over the next 50 years. It's not currently signaling intentions to challenge the United States globally, and it's possible that it never will. Nonetheless, the world that most of us want to see, or at least should want to see, is a world in which a country's share of global wealth converges on its share of global population. And the simple point to make is that sustaining U.S. strategic hegemony in that world is going to be more difficult. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's certainly going to be more difficult. Now, that's a kind of long-term issue. There are more acute problems, or problems having to do with our very recent past, and we talk about this a great deal in the book. Kagan may be right to say that we should not let the current crisis distort our historical perspective, but I think we cannot also not ignore the possibility that the exertions of maintaining the U.S. strategic position in the world may have been among the causes of the current crisis. Erik and I were both doctoral students of David Kaleo, who has devoted much of his career to warning about the ill effects of American hegemony on both its domestic political economy and the world political economy. And about 3 years ago at the IISS annual meeting, the Global Strategic Review, the famous Keynes biographer Robert Skidelsky drew specifically on Kaleo's work to argue that the macro imbalances between Chinese oversaving and American overspending are what, and I'm quoting Skidelsky here, are what enable the United States government to live beyond its means by getting other countries to finance its imperial pretensions. And Skidelsky went on to argue about, and again I'm quoting, the role of the U.S. fiscal deficit in precipitating financial meltdown. Now, this is something that Erik is much more of an expert in than I am, and there's always going to be a kind of chicken and egg argument about whether the problem of these imbalances has been one of American overspending or Chinese oversaving. But even if you assume, and Erik can discuss this at great length, even if you assume that Chinese savings had to be lent somewhere, you can't pretend that this situation did not, to a certain extent, how shall I put it, obscure the fact that America had to make, well, look, that America's huge defense budget and its global strategic role has implicitly involved choices. And those choices turned out, arguably, to be destructive. this is obviously unpacking a huge, and in this case probably a theoretically contentious argument about one of the sources of the crisis that we're still living through. But I'm going to, there is even if we can argue about the precise mechanisms, I'm going to read another quote, which is a key insight, I think, from Bill Emmett, who was the former editor of The Economist, who's now a current trustee of the IISS. And he was writing on the 10th anniversary of the 11 September attacks. He wrote this piece in the Times of London. And he too was arguing that among the most devastating consequences of September 11th was the global financial crisis. Along with Skidelsky, Emmett was arguing that the wars that bin Laden provoked were a significant cause of the crash, both in the direct costs that they incurred, but more important, and I think this is what's interesting, in the broader mindset they inspired. In his column on September 2011, Emmett wrote the following. Think about the psychology. And he's going back a few years. If Mr. Greenspan was so ideologically determined to keep his hands off the markets, why did he raise interest rates 6 times to burst the dot-com bubble in 1991? Why, after 2001, by contrast, did he keep pumping in credit to housing and banks, even as another bubble formed? Why did the fiscal policy under President George W. Bush also turn expansionary, with spending soaring and taxes cut? And Emmett also gives the example of the UK under Blair and Brown. And to continue quoting Emmett, the answer is simple. There was a war on, or rather 2 wars, not even counting the vague one on terror. At such times, the inclination to risk an economic global slowdown or recession diminishes. After 9/11, President Bush said the Americans should do the patriotic thing and go out spending again. Now look, I don't know if Emmett, in making this argument, was correct about everyone's specific and precise motivations for specific policies in the first decade of this century. But I think, as we argue in his book, he was clearly onto an important insight regarding the psychology of America's political class in relation to America's world role. American elites have been chronically reluctant to concede that the role of world policeman, to use that word, requires any kind of explicit trade-off against anything else, including American living standards. This is a familiar story. The Johnson administration was not willing to propose that kind of trade-off for the Vietnam War. The George W. Bush administration was not willing to do so regarding Iraq and Afghanistan. And I think a key point here, which is a difficult point, is that the problem is not confined to wars that are controversial or, in our view, unwise and unnecessary. In our view, the 1991 war to reverse Iraq's invasion of Kuwait was both necessary and justified, and it's easy to imagine future wars that are equally justified in light of America's security role. I would say an excellent example of a potential future war is in Korea. It's a good example because it was, after all, the battleground of America's first post-World War II police action. And I think it's important to think about that shift that took place in America's thinking about its role between the Second World War and the Korean War. After all, World War II was considered an existential contest in which it was natural for Americans to mobilize every sinew of state, society, and economy. But it was an emergency lasting for the United States less than 4 years. And by contrast, a permanent war footing, some phrase we use, which Jim properly highlighted, and I think that the chart there can't really be described as anything else. A permanent war footing is going to require either an endless source of deficit financing, which is not impossible. Erik will tell you why it's not impossible, but it's problematic, or a more fundamental rethink about the purpose of American state and society. Now, I have a lot more to say, and I think I'm not going to say it because I'm going to run out of time very quickly. And just to try to move to a conclusion of this part of the presentation very quickly. When President Obama came into office, he did seem very conscious and articulate about these kinds of constraints and these kinds of trade-offs. I think that's why his speech at the end of his first year in office at West Point was very significant when he said, "I refuse to set goals that go beyond our responsibility, our means, or our interests. I must weigh all of the challenges our nation faces, and then he quoted Eisenhower, as you recall. And it was kind of a promise to restore a kind of small c conservatism to American strategic policy. And the question that arises, and which we really grapple with in our book, is whether this is really possible. And I hope you won't be discouraged from reading the book if I say that we don't really give a definitive answer to that question. I think Jim suggested we do, and we probably should have, but we're a little bit hedged. What we do instead is to lay out a framework of three broad options for American foreign policy, which are ideal types that lead into each other and across parties and across ideologies. No individual really fits into any of them. One of them is a pluralist view. A second is what we call an idealist view, which idealists include neoconservatives and liberal internationalists, Robert Kagan and Madeleine Albright. I should say that when I came to the IISS 15 years ago, I was seized of Balkans issues, and I was certainly pronouncing idealist arguments regarding the Balkans. I wouldn't repudiate them, although I think they've gotten us into some trouble. And then a kind of middle school, which we call realist. Not a particularly original term, but the key point is it's not really to be confused with the school of international relations theory that goes by the same name. It's more of a attitude or a proclivity, mindful of American limits, about the dangers of overextension and the problem of unintended consequences. And I guess, there's a kind of there's a lazy inclination of much political analysis to always assume that the truth lies somewhere in between. I don't necessarily say that. The pluralist view, which is, as I suggested, is represented by our mentor David Kaleo, has a lot to argue for it. I think in practice, as an empirical point of view, as an empirical proposition, it is unlikely that the United States is going to abandon, it's going to retrench so significantly that it's really going to accept a, how to put it, a pluralist view of its responsibilities. Let me give you one or two examples. I'll give you two examples. This realist president last spring pretty much explicitly committed the United States to preventing Iran from developing a nuclear weapon. Jim, you're right that we would probably argue that in a pluralist world we have to accept things like countries like Iran developing nuclear capabilities. But the United States is not accepting it. And I really expect, I don't know, expect is a strong word, I would not be surprised if we find ourselves in another war in the Middle East relating to Iran's nuclear ambitions. I would say the same thing about there's another aspect, again, maybe I should really close and we can talk about this in Q&A. There has been a great ratcheting up of of America's sense of its own moral responsibility in the world. This is embodied in things like the responsibility to protect, and I would take it kind of seriously. If you look at the Libya intervention, it was argued about in the U.S. government, but we ended up doing it. Now, we ended up doing it according to a model by which we would hand a lot of responsibility over to allies. But I think it's nonetheless clear that America's sense of its humanitarian responsibilities are greater now, certainly, than they were during the last retrenchment that we compare this one to under the Nixon administration. Now, what you detected in this book is correct. It may make, logically, it probably makes more sense and would probably be more better for America's long-term economic future and sort of realistic sense of its place in the world to accept the implications of a more pluralist world, to accept that that includes nuclear pluralism, to accept that as horrific as what we may find going on in Syria, that really there's not that much we can do about it. But I don't think that American foreign policy is going to be based on this kind of radical pluralism. There's a lot else in the book that I mean, let me just mention 3 themes that are worth discussing before I turn over to Erik for some mopping up action. We have a somewhat lengthy discussion of American political paralysis, which I think is the most acute threat we're facing right now. We have also a lengthy discussion of the occasionally absurd, but at other times rather enlightening debate about American exceptionalism, which is, of course, a theological proposition on one level, but it also has a secular version, and it's the secular version that I would say unites Barack Obama and Robert Kagan in their basic view of American responsibilities. And the third theme of our book, which we do spend a long time discussing, and Jim referred to it at some length, is essentially about the future of the West, specifically the transatlantic community. And if there's an Obama doctrine, which if I wasn't running out of time, I would talk about a little bit more, it certainly depends on American allies helping to take up the slack. And essentially, we have not such diminished responsibilities, but a more narrowly defined set of, or a more narrowly defined assertion of U.S. interests. And if there's any way to square that circle, it's obviously relying on allies. And that reliance was at the heart of the Libyan intervention, which was successful in most terms that I can think of, but is not a perfect template for the future. And in any event, it doesn't seem compatible right now with the prospective breakdown of the euro and conceivably the breakdown of the European Union, about which Erik may want to say something.
Thanks, Dan. I'd like to thank you all for coming this afternoon, and the IISS for giving us the opportunity to write this book. This was a lot of fun. I promise not to give you too long a formal presentation, just like 2 or 3 minutes to flesh out a couple of themes that are important to understand where we come from with this volume, and it starts where Dana left off, really. You see, when we started this project and began to look at the role of U.S. global leadership, one of the things that struck us almost immediately was that the United States is relatively unique in the world for its broad-based political consensus on the destiny of its own government to lead the world. It's very difficult if you go to China to find lots of Chinese people who talk about Chinese global leadership in the sense that they want to go out and solve problems in the world or project their model on the world. Rather, they seem to be want to be left alone by the world, or at least get the opportunity to interact with the world in a way that's unconstrained, but not within the responsibility that leadership entails. I think the same would be true of Europe, even when the Europeans get all excited about their potential as a soft power to project European global leadership. You find very quickly that this doesn't amount to the same kind of commitment to exceptionalism that we find quite easily if you just listen to the speeches that have been given at these recent Republican and Democratic conventions. Now, this notion of American exceptionalism is important because it forces us to confront the true nature of American power. You see, one of the things we look at in the book is trying to understand to what extent power is dependent on the distribution of resources across countries. So we look at that map of this defense spending and you go, wow, the United States spends an awful lot more money than anybody else. It must have an awful lot more power. or whether we should use different conceptions of power, sociological conceptions of power, that look at our ability to control the environment around us, power as a function of collective action. What gave the United States such tremendous power at the end of the Second World War was its ability to foster collective action together with its European allies, to restructure the global economy in order better to rationalize the division of labor across countries, to stabilize trade and finance, and to promote prosperity according to different models in different parts of this West. And the question that we have is to the extent to which these countries are emerging quite rapidly, like China and Russia and Brazil and India and all the rest, or even these middle powers like Turkey, to the extent to which they're emerging quite rapidly, to what extent does this confound or interrupt our ability to foster collective action at the global level? Well, think about the progression of multilateral trade negotiations that we've had, ending, of course, with the Doha Development Round. Why is the Doha Development Round so moribund? Why is it that it seems as though trade negotiators are much more interested to push for bilateral deals, this spaghetti bowl of complicated bilateral relationships, rather than pursue multilateral trade negotiations? Because we know that these multilateral trade negotiations are a much more effective way of controlling the global trading environment. Same thing with environmental protection. Why is it that we cannot seem to get the kind of cooperation we need in environmental protection? We see the United States would love to lead on these issues, but the problem is that these emerging powers are unwilling to follow, and even our traditional allies don't seem too inclined to follow. So we may believe we have this exceptional leadership capability, but the institutions for our leadership are not resulting in the control over the environment, the kind of power that the United States needs in order to pursue its foreign policy objectives. So we're stuck in a situation where we have a leader without followers. And we're trying to understand, to a certain extent, how we can generate that followership in the rest of the world. What do we have to concede to these other global actors, the Europeans in particular, let's imagine? What do we have to concede to them to get them to assume some of their responsibility? Think about the speech that Barack Obama gave on the 28th of March in 2011. He said, look, some people think that leadership is doing what you think is right, no matter what anybody else says. But I believe that leadership is creating the conditions within which other actors can assume their responsibilities and undertake actions that satisfy American national interest. So if we can get other people to do that, like Tom Sawyer getting you to paint his fence, then that's a kind of a power that the United States would like to have. And what are the conditions that bring that power about? Well, we look at it and we try to understand that from the stories that Dana has been telling. It's very difficult for the United States to exert that kind of leadership when it can't be very generous in terms of the concessions that it makes. And it's very difficult when the United States cannot make decisions effectively internally for the United States to exert that kind of leadership. It cannot make concessions in bargaining abroad if it cannot agree on a negotiating position at home. And indeed, it's very difficult for the United States when the concessions that it wants cause countries to reverse spectacularly the formulas that they're using in order to foster development. And this is where this macroeconomic imbalances story comes into play, right? The United States has been playing the consumer of last resort. If the United States did not consume all of the exports that were sent out of China, and China wanted to continue to maintain a net export position, somebody else would have had to consume those exports in order to foster Chinese growth. Who is that somebody else in the world economy? It's not immediately obvious. If the Chinese are unwilling to play that role, consuming their own manufacturers, then who is going to consume them, if not the United States? That's the experiment we're in right now, right? As the United States is deleveraging, contracting, and the Chinese economy is slowing down. It's slowing down because there is no consumption in the West. It's the problem that Germany faces within Europe as well. Who was supposed to foster Germany's export-led growth? The Eurozone as a whole had a balanced current account position with the rest of the world. So Germany's net exports were somebody else's net deficits. And that somebody else just happened to be the countries on the Eurozone periphery. Now, we can talk a bit about the point that Jim raised about whether this is a debt problem or it's a surplus savings problem. Dana and I had endless arguments about whether we were going to include that Skidelsky quote Because we have slightly different interpretations of this, but the bottom line that I want to give you is it's much easier to make a country borrow than it is to make a country lend. I can force a country to borrow simply by going into its sovereign debt markets and buying up all the sovereign debt I want. But how do I force a country to lend? This is the problem that we have in the Eurozone. It was very easy to make the peripheral countries in the Eurozone borrow simply by going in and bidding up the prices of their sovereign debt. But now that Germany wants to take that money back, it's disrupting the economic performance of those economies. And so the question is, how do we force Germany to lend? And the answer is, not very easily, unless, of course, we can use either the Target 2 system or the European Central Bank. Target 2, for those of you who are interested, is far too complicated for me to explain right now. The bottom line at the end of this tale goes like this. The United States may find itself in a situation where it simply cannot foster the kind of cooperation it needs in order to achieve its global objectives, particularly given the situation in Europe right now, where Europe is retrenching. Their ability to sustain the Obama administration's pivot to the Pacific and the responsibilities that this entails for the European allies are considerable, I would suggest. Their ability to support that is diminishing rapidly, which leaves the Obama administration, or any future administration, whether Obama or Romney, to have to consider whether they're going to reverse that pivot or simply complement the forces in Europe with another increase. My assumption is that given the perception of America's leadership role, the United States is likely to make that overcommitment. And if it makes that overcommitment, it will do it to the detriment of the U.S. economy and to the weakening of America's ability, both to foster cooperation and to maintain the resources that give it the potential for power in the future. Thank you.
Dan and Erik, thank you for those summaries. I'll turn now straight to the audience for some short, succinct questions. Would you please identify yourself and any affiliation you want to include? Yes, sir.
I'm Hank Gaffney from CNA. Been 51 years in Washington, minus 3 years in Brussels. I have no idea where you get these responsibilities. Or somebody talks about sharing the burden. Where is that burden document? Where is the burden document?
Hold it a little further away.
Yeah. Does somebody have these documents which list all these responsibilities and obligations and commitments and all those things? I've never seen one of those documents.
Okay. We've only got about 20 minutes, so if we could keep both questions and answers short, we'll get one. Let's get an answer to this gentleman's question first.
Well, I don't think the document exists, so I'm not quite sure how to answer the question. It is, but
I think that's his point.
yeah, I understand the point, but it's not as though the sense of obligation and the real responsibilities aren't there. I mean, let's look at the Persian Gulf. Real responsibilities. Well, look, it's not a secret or a mystery or an untold story how the United States and how this administration in particular came to a position where it publicly committed itself to prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons. It has to do with our previous commitments in the Middle East. It obviously has to do with our relationship with Israel. The people in the administration tell me it also has to do with an absolutely clear determination, a really clear judgment by the administration itself and by President Obama that an Iran with nuclear weapons would be intolerable in terms of U.S. interests. But those U.S. interests are, needless to say, partly are largely defined by these burdens that we're talking about.
I would say that one document does exist that I think is a very important one, and that is the United Nations Declaration on the Responsibility to Protect. And as you read this book, I think you will join me in concluding that the logic that Dana and Erik lay out here is that we actually have reached the high water mark of humanitarian intervention in world politics. And that was a sad realization for me. Yes.
Collaborating. There are two interventions that occurred by the U.S. One was in Lebanon in '58. We went in, we told everyone, stop fighting. Within 3 months, we came out looking good, respectable. Secondly, in '91, when we went to Iraq, the whole community backed us, and the Arabs paid for it. So it was an intervention that was successful. We made money out of it. When it came to the second Iraq War, we had our European allies, the Germans, the French, the Turks, and many Arabs who said, don't go, it's going to be pretty bad. So I think it depends on which war you want to go to and which intervention your allies share. If there's no sharing of interest, you're not going to have any allies, and it's going to be costly.
Okay, we'll move on to another question. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you very much. Clara Donald from the Brookings Institution. I had a question for Erik, and which was simply if you could maybe elaborate on how you think the Europeans should respond to the US pivot towards the Pacific.
Well, I think that's a good question. I mean, there are at least three things that the Europeans have to be concerned about at the moment, right? And one of them is called Egypt, because if the situation in Egypt were to deteriorate rapidly, I think the Europeans would find themselves with both a security and an immigration challenge that they would find very difficult to manage. The other is the rest of the Maghreb region. I think the stability of Libya and the stability of Tunisia is very open to question. We have a steady stream of migration coming across the border that needs to be managed. And the third thing is Syria. And the situation for the Europeans in Syria is, I think, quite dramatic because they have very significant interests there. And there's a very strong potential for coordination. There's just no desire to explicitly announce a policy that could try to bring this to an end. I don't know what that policy would be, but my sense is that the Europeans are going to have to take some kind of very strong role in that if the United States is not going to find itself holding the bag. Now, I think I take Hank's point about there's no document that's written that says that the United States owns Syria. But if Syria were to go up, and the potential for extended conflict in Syria is quite high, our new dean at Saiz Valley Nasser has made it quite clear that even if the ruling regime were to lead, the sectarian conflict that would ensue after that could last for a long time. The United States could find itself deeply involved in that conflict, if only because it has responsibilities to many of Syria's neighbors as well, not least Iraq and Israel. So I think that the Europeans need to play a more robust role, but the Europeans are not actually equipping themselves for that.
I go all the way back to the end of the audience.
Daniel Serwood from Johns Hopkins SAIS. I'm prompted to this remark by something Jim said at the beginning about your concluding in the end that offshore balancing is a good idea. If that's not the case, you'll correct it. But it seems to me that discussions of this sort too easily get into the rut of military capabilities. And offshore balancing, with all due respect, is fundamentally a military strategy, not really a global strategy. It seems to me if you look at our national security challenges, they're almost all civilian except for the possibility that we might initiate a war against Iran. But for the next 10 years, we just don't have serious military challenges to vital American national security interests. But there are lots of civilian challenges, and I would regard Syria as fundamentally a civilian challenge. Policeman is the wrong metaphor. The right metaphor, in my view, is fireman. And most of being a fireman is in preventing fires, not in putting them out.
Do you accept it? The next segment,
I find it a very compelling argument. What I don't, I don't know that in the real world it's going to work out that our challenges are not going to be military ones, although I accept the logic of what you're saying. But the example I've been dwelling on is Iran. We might start that war, or our Israeli ally might start that war, but it's going to be driven by sort of the recklessness and, in a certain sense, the cluelessness of an Iranian regime that isn't smart enough to, develop what it sees as its strategic assets without also, in whatever language and whatever translation you want to use, saying that a member of the United Nations who happens to be important to the world's only superpower shouldn't exist. So I guess I would have to say I expect a military conflict involving the United States and Iran in the next 4 years. I don't advocate it. I think probably forbearance, strategic forbearance would be a better option. But I think the world, the U.S. is going to act like a cop in this regard. I guess I said I accepted your analysis, but now I'm going to quibble a little bit. It's fine to say that we should have somehow found a way to put out the fire in Syria, and I suppose that's true. But I still think that we haven't put it out. It's raging, and if savage violence against civilians reaches a certain magnitude, pressures on the next administration, whether it's Obama or Romney, to get involved militarily could be overwhelming.
Can I just add one thing, Jim?
Sure.
I'm going to stretch this out. Daniel, I'm not sure I'm going to be as generous as Dana in accepting the premise of your question. I think that the problem is the United States does not view a lot of the civilian challenges as a vital national interest. It only begins to view them as a vital national interest once they've evolved into military challenges. And so we tend to stand back from situations when it might be much more cost-effective to intervene, right? The Balkans would be a good example. If we had intervened actively in the early 1990s, maybe the conflict would not have been so costly later on that decade. Maybe Dana's a much better expert on this than I am, but the idea of early intervention with civilian measures is one that I think the United States would probably benefit from. But the United States looks at the situation and goes, this is not my region. Why should I be responsible for this, right? In the North Africa situation that I described, particularly in the context of Egypt and the Maghreb region, is an area where Europe should be intervening in civilian ways. But if it doesn't intervene in civilian ways, and the extent to which aid is going from Europe to North Africa is actually very low, much lower than it should be, if it doesn't intervene in civilian ways and it becomes a military conflict, do you think that the United States is going to allow a military conflict centered on Egypt to go without U.S. involvement? I don't see that. I'm not predicting that, but I'm just saying, when it becomes a military issue, then the United States will get involved.
That's a failure of imagination that does not complement us.
Let's take two questions. The first one from an old friend in the second row, and the other one a new friend in the third row.
Thank you. Samir Sumaidai, formerly Iraqi ambassador to the United States. We're looking at a slide here which shows relative military spending. This does not relate or does not correspond directly to relative military capability or the capability to coerce or impose your will. And I'm just focusing on, say, relatively between the United States and China. China gets, I would argue, a great deal more military capacity out of every dollar than the United States. And if it came to a confrontation, this picture would be misleading. If you take Saudi Arabia and Brazil and allow for geographic location, I don't think the relative military capacity is represented in this. The point I'm trying to illustrate here is that the United States spends a great deal of money on high-tech and really high-powered military machinery and equipment and organization. A sledgehammer is not the best instrument when you are faced with a swarm of mosquitoes. The problems we have in the world, we saw that in Iraq. Iran invested in Iraq pennies. United States invested in Iraq billions of dollars. The result does not reflect the relative amount of spending. Thank you.
No, over here. I think, in fairness to our authors, I think they would agree with that and make the point quite appropriately in the book. Yes, sir.
Robert James, I'm a businessman in New York. Allin and Jones, you did a good job of assessing the world police job that the United States faces. If you're a businessman, or as a matter of fact, if you're a military man, assessment will not do. You have to have specific recommendations, and you also tell how to carry them out. So, could you look at what you would tell President Romney as to what he should do in Asia? We're already all over in Asia. Should we be more there? And also tell him what we should do in the Persian Gulf or in the Middle East, where we're the only power there that's significant. And just, you can sort of skip how we deal with Iraq, with Israel and the United States and the Middle East.
A terrific wind-up question.
Now, I think, well, this, your preface there, Bob, gets to something that I, as an editor, often say to my authors now, which is that a good article for my journal should illuminate a problem. I'm not necessarily interested, and I'll tell you why in a second, I'm not necessarily that interested in articles with specific policy recommendations. And the reason I'm not is because these recommendations are often presented in kind of bullet form, clearly in language that is meant to, in most cases, is meant to be directed at the U.S. administration of the day, with content that that U.S. administration has probably thought of already. I mean, it's not as though there are any secrets or any magic bullets in these problems. So I really do think that, and here I actually, I speak to someone who was very much involved in this project. You know, I really do not think, I don't apologize for the fact that maybe on some issues I think we laid out the situation, an analysis of the situation without being very, very specific about which way we think the United States should go. So therefore, for example, you know, we described a pluralist view of the world in which, in its most rigorous form, would accept that a country like Iran, given the security situation it faces, is going to do everything it can to develop a nuclear weapons capability and possibly a nuclear weapon. And that the cost of trying to prevent that would be too great for the United States. It would be too great to bear, but it would be greater than the benefit. Does this book say that we should allow Iran to, I mean, we should concede an Iranian nuclear weapon? It doesn't really, because I don't think it observes that we're not going to. And so it doesn't make that recommendation.
Well, you know, on that last point, I think you sell yourself short on your argumentative power. One of the first things I learned in writing opinion columns, where you try to shape opinion, is that when you quote one point of view of the argument at length, and don't quote any countervailing view, you're deliberately shaping opinion. And that's what you do in the book, and on several points, including the last one you just made. But that's all to your credit, because you are arguing your point. I think at this point, the 45th President of the United States would say thank you guys, and thank everybody here, and that's the end of the day. Thank you.
Thank you.